The war had ended. The world moved on. Cities rebuilt, nations signed treaties, and a new order rose from the ashes of the Second World War. But in one forgotten corner of the Pacific, a single man refused to believe it. He clutched his rifle, hid among the shadows of palm trees, and watched every stranger as if they were the enemy. For him, the empire still lived, the battle still raged, and surrender was unthinkable. His name was Hiroo Onoda. And for nearly 3 decades after the war ended, he kept fighting it alone. Born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, Onoda grew up in a world where duty and loyalty were drilled into children from an early age. His father was stern, his teachers stricter still, all teaching him one truth: Japan was eternal, and sacrifice for the emperor was the highest honor. By the time he reached manhood, war had already consumed Asia. Japan's armies marched across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Onoda, like millions of young men, was swept into the tide. He trained as an intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. Unlike ordinary infantry, his job was not to die in a blaze of glory but to survive, to gather information, to wage sabotage behind enemy lines. His instructors taught him the art of guerrilla warfare: how to melt into jungles, how to use terrain, how to sow confusion among enemies. The words of his commanding officer echoed in his mind: "Under no circumstances are you to surrender. You may die, but you must never give up." It was a creed that would define the rest of his life. In December 1944, with Japan's empire collapsing and American forces closing in, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His mission: disrupt enemy operations, destroy airstrips and piers, and never allow the Americans to take the island easily. He was only 22 years old, but his orders carried the weight of eternity. He was told to fight until victory or until death. What no one imagined was that he would interpret those orders literally, far beyond the end of the war itself. When Onoda arrived, the situation was already dire. Allied forces had taken much of the Philippines, and Japanese units were being annihilated. Onoda joined a small group of stragglers, just a handful of men still resisting in the jungle. Supplies were scarce, communication cut off, and no reinforcements would ever come. But they did not know that yet. They believed the empire would strike back. They believed surrender was shame. And so, with rifles polished and spirits hardened, they vanished into the forests. The war officially ended in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's unconditional surrender. Across the Pacific, soldiers laid down their arms, raised white flags, and stepped into a world forever changed. But in the dense jungles of Lubang, Onoda and his men heard only rumors. Leaflets dropped from planes claimed Japan had surrendered, but they dismissed them as American trickery. Newspapers left in villages proclaimed peace, but Onoda examined them carefully and declared them fake. How could the empire fall? How could the emperor yield? No, this was psychological warfare. The war had to be continuing. So they fought on. For Onoda and his companions, life became an endless cycle of raids and retreats. By day, they hid in dense foliage, watching the villages below, noting the movements of locals. By night, they crept down to steal rice, coconuts, and occasionally cattle. Farmers would wake to find fields trampled, granaries emptied, and livestock slaughtered. To them, it seemed like bandits haunting the hills. In truth, it was the remnants of an empire refusing to fade. Whenever villagers approached their hiding places, Onoda treated them as enemy combatants. Shots rang out from the trees, and rumors spread of ghost soldiers living in the mountains. The Philippine constabulary organized search parties, but the jungle was vast and merciless. Onoda knew every creek, every ridge, every path that could vanish into green shadow. They never caught him. Seasons changed, years passed, but for Onoda, time was frozen in 1945. He polished his rifle daily, repaired his uniform with patches of bark and cloth, and drilled his tiny unit as if reinforcements would arrive tomorrow. Each man swore to die rather than surrender, yet reality chipped away at them one by one. Disease, hunger, and despair claimed his comrades. Some were killed in skirmishes with local police. Others slipped away, believing the war truly was over. By 1950, only a few remained. By the 1970s, Onoda would be the last. Still, he refused to yield. Each time he saw an aircraft fly overhead, he told himself it was an American patrol. Each time he heard fireworks from a distant fiesta, he assumed it was a battle beginning in another sector. His world shrank to the size of the island, and every sound, every shadow, was filtered through the lens of endless war. The years hardened him into legend. Locals came to fear the man in the jungle, the soldier who never stopped. They called him a phantom, a ghost of the old empire. Children were warned not to wander too far, lest the soldier take them. Hunters swore they saw him moving like a shadow among the palms, always armed, always watchful. Even the Philippine government began to treat him not as a criminal but as a strange, lingering relic of another time. But for Hiroo Onoda, this was no legend. It was duty, and duty did not end with rumors of surrender. The jungle was his fortress, his battlefield, and his prison. For most men, a year in such isolation would break the spirit. For Hiroo Onoda, it became routine. He memorized every bend of every river, every fruit-bearing tree, every cave that offered cover during the monsoon rains. His survival training had prepared him to live off the land, but what sustained him most was belief. The war was still going. He was still a soldier. His duty was not finished. At first, he was not entirely alone. A handful of other Japanese stragglers had remained on Lubang after 1945. Together they hunted, cooked stolen rice, and planned ambushes against what they thought were American patrols. But gradually his comrades disappeared. Some were killed in firefights with local police. Others simply walked out of the jungle, surrendering when hunger gnawed too deep or when the truth could no longer be denied. Onoda watched each departure as betrayal. In his mind, the empire demanded loyalty until death. Those who left had abandoned their honor. By 1949, only 3 men remained with him: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private Yuichi Akatsu, and Private Kinshichi Kozuka. Together they lived like a family of ghosts, moving in silence through thickets, setting traps for chickens, patching uniforms with thread pulled from sacks. They cleaned their rifles as if the emperor himself might inspect them at any moment. They whispered of reinforcements, of a counterattack that surely would come once Japan rebuilt its strength. To keep morale alive, Onoda spoke with certainty. "We are not forgotten. One day we will march back in triumph." Reality, however, crept in. Leaflets fluttered down from airplanes, announcing Japan's surrender. Newspapers left by villagers declared the war long over. In 1952, even letters from family members were airdropped, begging the soldiers to come home. Onoda read them and shook his head. To him, it was enemy trickery. The Americans were clever. They would forge anything to break his will. He told his men, "If the war was truly over, our commander would come himself. Until then, we fight." This refusal hardened into ritual. When search parties scoured the island, Onoda led his men deeper into the mountains. When villagers ventured too close, shots cracked from the treeline. Over the years, more than 30 skirmishes occurred. Several farmers were killed. To Onoda, it was war. To the locals, it was terror. They began to call him the man of the forest, a phantom who could not be caught. But the years did not leave him untouched. Disease gnawed at his comrades. Shimada was wounded in 1953 during a clash with a search party and died soon after. Akatsu surrendered in 1950, walking out of the jungle and turning himself in. That left only Onoda and Kozuka. The two men clung to each other like brothers. They divided every meal in half, stitched each other's wounds, and took turns watching through the night. For more than 20 years, they lived as the last embers of a war the world had already forgotten. During this time, the Philippines changed. Villages expanded. Roads cut into forests. Radios played music from distant Manila. But for Onoda, the outside world remained enemy territory. He and Kozuka destroyed rice stores, burned piles of crops, and ambushed work parties, believing they were sabotaging supplies for the American occupation. Each time, they vanished into the forest before authorities could catch them. Their actions killed civilians, deepening resentment. To the government, they were outlaws. To Onoda, they were soldiers executing their orders. By the 1960s, his story had become legend. Newspapers occasionally reported sightings of Japanese holdouts in the Philippines. Expeditions searched the island, calling out in Japanese, begging him to surrender. Onoda never believed them. He suspected enemy tricks, loudspeakers meant to lure him into capture. Once, he and Kozuka found radios left behind with news broadcasts. They listened in silence to reports of the Tokyo Olympics, of the Cold War, of a Japan transformed into a modern nation. Onoda shook his head. Propaganda, he said. Impossible. If Japan was hosting games, then surely the empire had triumphed, and his orders remained. Then came the greatest blow of all. In 1972, after nearly 3 decades in hiding, Onoda and Kozuka clashed with a local police patrol near a rice paddy. Shots rang out. Kozuka fell, mortally wounded. Onoda dragged his body back into the jungle and buried him beneath bamboo leaves. For the first time, he was truly alone. Alone, he survived by sheer will. He raided less often to avoid drawing attention. He crafted hidden shelters lined with palm fronds, learned to catch eels with his bare hands, and stored dried bananas in pits. He spoke aloud less and less, until days passed in silence. The jungle swallowed his voice, his past, his world. Only duty remained. By 1973, Hiroo Onoda had been fighting a war for 28 years. To the villagers, he was a ghost. To the Philippine government, he was a nuisance. To Japan, he was almost forgotten. But soon, his story would return to the world, and end in a way no one could have predicted. By the early 1970s, the legend of Hiroo Onoda had spread far beyond the Philippines. Newspapers in Tokyo ran strange stories of a man still fighting the Second World War, nearly 30 years after Japan's surrender. Some dismissed it as rumor, others as exaggeration, but curiosity grew. For the people of Lubang, it was no rumor. It was a haunting reality. Every so often, a barn burned, a granary was raided, or a farmer was shot at by a shadow in the trees. The ghost soldier was real, and he would not stop. The Japanese government, embarrassed and intrigued, organized missions to find him. They sent search parties with loudspeakers, pleading in Japanese, "Onoda, the war is over. Come home." They dropped letters from his family, even photographs. Onoda examined them, then rejected them. Clever forgeries, he decided. The enemy was trying harder than ever to break him. That meant his mission was still vital. But the world was changing in ways Onoda could not deny. He found plastic wrappers in the villages he raided. Radios crackled with songs that spoke of an entirely new Japan. Once, he stumbled upon a transistor set and listened in the dark. He heard of men landing on the moon. He heard of skyscrapers rising in Tokyo. He heard words like economic miracle and Olympics. Yet none of it pierced his armor of doubt. He believed it all to be a grand illusion, a psychological war staged by the Americans. His orders still stood. Everything changed in 1974. A young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki set out on a personal quest. Suzuki had told friends, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, the panda, and the abominable snowman in that order." Sounded like a joke, but unlike others, Suzuki was determined. He flew to the Philippines, trekked into Lubang's forests, and against all odds, he found him. It was a surreal encounter. Suzuki stumbled into a clearing where Onoda stood, rifle slung across his shoulder, uniform patched into tatters but still worn with military pride. Suzuki called out in Japanese. Onoda, gaunt and wary, raised his weapon. But the words Suzuki spoke were unlike any he had heard in decades. "Onoda-san, the war is over. Japan is waiting for you." Onoda listened, but suspicion held firm. He had heard this line before many times. And yet something about Suzuki was different. He was not a soldier, not a policeman, not a farmer. He was a young man with no weapon, no authority, only conviction. Onoda lowered his rifle slightly. He said, "If the war has truly ended, bring me my commanding officer. Only he can relieve me of my duty." Suzuki returned to Japan with Onoda's demand. And remarkably, the government obliged. They found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commander, who had long since retired and was working in a bookstore. The news stunned him. One of his men was still fighting, obeying orders from 1945. Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang. On March 9, 1974, the moment finally came. Onoda emerged from the jungle to meet his commander. His uniform hung in shreds, his rifle still polished, his posture still rigid as that of a soldier on parade. He saluted. Taniguchi, gray-haired and stooped with age, stepped forward. With solemn authority, he read the order rescinding all combat operations. "The war has ended. You are relieved of duty." Onoda froze, as though the words themselves cracked the world he had built. For nearly 30 years, he had lived in a reality where surrender was unthinkable. Now, the one man he trusted had spoken the truth. Slowly, carefully, Onoda unstrapped his rifle. He presented it bolt-polished, bayonet gleaming, ammunition intact. Alongside it, he handed over his sword, still sharp, and a dagger his mother had given him in 1944 in case he was captured. Then he bowed. The war was finally over, for him. Onoda's return to Japan was a sensation. Crowds filled the airport to glimpse the soldier who had refused to surrender for 29 years. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and banners waved. Some hailed him as a hero of loyalty and perseverance. Others condemned him as a relic of fanaticism, a man whose stubbornness had cost the lives of innocent villagers in Lubang. For Onoda himself, the return was overwhelming. Japan was unrecognizable. The bombed-out cities of his youth had become a land of neon lights, bullet trains, and skyscrapers. The empire he had fought for was gone, replaced by a pacifist democracy allied with the very nation he once called his enemy. He confessed in interviews that he felt like a stranger in his own country. The Philippine government faced a dilemma. Onoda had been responsible for raids and deaths long after the war. Farmers demanded justice, but President Ferdinand Marcos, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the case, granted him a full pardon. Onoda was free. In time, he tried to rebuild a life. He wrote an autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. He moved to Brazil, starting a cattle ranch, seeking peace in the wide-open fields that felt nothing like the claustrophobic jungle. Later, he returned to Japan and opened a survival training school for youth, teaching lessons of endurance and willpower. He spoke often about his beliefs, that loyalty was sacred, that perseverance was essential, and that one must never surrender to despair. And yet, beneath the surface, he remained haunted. He admitted in later years that he had struggled to adjust to modern Japan. He was both celebrated and pitied, remembered as the soldier who never surrendered, yet also as a man trapped by outdated orders. When asked if he regretted his decades in the jungle, he replied, "No, I carried out my orders. That was my duty." Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. In Japan, tributes poured in, calling him a man of extraordinary resolve, a symbol of a vanished era. In the Philippines, some remembered him with bitterness, as the phantom who had stolen lives and food long after peace. His story remains one of the strangest and most haunting of the 20th century, because in the end, Hiroo Onoda was not simply a soldier. He was a man who lived inside a war long after it ended, who carried an empire on his back long after it had crumbled, and who embodied both the nobility and the tragedy of absolute obedience. His life was proof that sometimes the hardest battlefield to leave is not the jungle, but the mind.